Hello, this is week 2 of the patrol procedures class. There's certain things, bases that we have to cover before we can really move forward. One of them is crime scene stuff. I mean, this class is taught obviously from the perspective of a patrol officer, right? So we're not going to get too off in the weeds with criminal investigation type content. However, understand that in the patrol division, you're going to be the first on the scene the vast majority of times to these crimes. And so you do have to understand the process well enough to know what not to do and what to do and why you're doing things the way that you're doing. So that being said, your first responsibility when you show up on a scene is going to be to protect life and property. So like if we show up at a scene, a burglary in progress or whatever, our first order of business is going to be, if we can, to thwart the crime and to take the perpetrator into custody. That's going to be priority number one, right? If we're showing up at the scene or the reports of shots fired, right, our first obligation is going to be to try to interrupt that crime if we can, if it's still ongoing when we arrive, address threats to life. So if somebody is shooting, we may have to shoot them to stop the threat. And then also we have a responsibility to secure the crime scene. So once the ongoing threat, the ongoing danger, the crime itself is interrupted or over, and there isn't a threat to life, then our main responsibility comes that we need to lock it down. We need to preserve the scene and we need to preserve evidence. And we need to identify where evidence might be because it could be a very small geographic area or it could be a very large geographic area. It just depends on the facts of the individual crime. And so our first responsibility is to secure the scene, to make sure everybody's safe, to address threats to safety, and so on like that. Then our second responsibility is going to be to preserve the crime scene, preserve the evidence, identify and preserve the evidence. And so, that being said, once we've done with that, then we may or may not be enlisted to help with other aspects of the investigation. It depends on how well funded your police department is and how many investigators they have. You may have to canvass the neighborhood, you may have to conduct interviews, you may have to collect evidence, even, and in some circumstances. Or if you can see that there's items of evidence that are about to be destroyed or in danger of being damaged or tampered with or whatever, you may have to proactively go ahead and collect that. So that being said, that's really what the lessons are about this week. And then we're going to have our first report writing assignment. And then also the other half of what we're going to do this week is we're going to talk about statutory law. You need to be able to read the statutes and identify the elements of the crime. Because again, if you're going to enforce the law, you have to know what the law is. And we're not lawyers and we're not trying to be, but in order for us to do our job, we have to be able to interpret the statutes well enough to identify what the elements of a crime are. Because there's plenty of situations that you're going to encounter as a police officer where maybe off the top of your head, you're not even sure, is this a crime? Or surely this is a crime, and then you're trying to find the statute that identifies it as a crime. So that being said, we do the best we can with the tools we have, but one of our best tools is just to be able to go, and you can do it from your phone, you can do it from a computer, whatever. Is just to find the statute, read the elements, and make sure what you got And sometimes, it's not what you thought, you know, and sometimes you can't find it. A good example of that was in the state of Missouri, when a victim is closer to 18, there are fewer kind of protections about what you can enforce. So, for example, if there's sexual contact, then that's fine. But when we're talking about like things that I would call grooming behaviors, where they're actually like online and saying, "Hey, I want to see your breasts" or whatever, and they're basically grooming, and trying to solicit the child to do things, you know, if they're 16, 17 years old or whatever, that's technically not against a law in the state of Missouri. Other states are going to vary. It's just the way that the way of things right now in Missouri, and that could change too in the next legislative session. They could fix that. I mean, but I had a particular case where that became an issue, where basically he was grooming this child, and he was well over, you know, he was in his 30s, and he's trying to basically get this, 16-year-old girl to date him, and in the end, all we had was inappropriate conversations, where he was talking about sexual things. But technically speaking, the way the statutes are written right now in Missouri, that by itself is not illegal. There has to be an action, in other words, you know, if if he would have if she would have agreed, to sleep with him or whatever, then we would have had a crime. But, you know, just the talk of it wasn't illegal. So you have to be able to look those statutes up and find it for yourself. And that is sometimes, you know, time consuming and tedious work. If you don't already have an idea of what you're looking for. So when you've done this for a few years and you've gotten kind of a broad base of experience or whatever, then you'll know what the statute is called. So, there's lots of what I would call like niche statutes that are very specific. So one of them is non-consensual dissemination of private sexual images, right? It means basically somebody took a nude image of you and disseminated it, sent it to people without your consent. That is a crime, a specific crime in the state of Missouri. And the only real elements to it is that basically an image got transmitted and you did not consent to it. That's it. You know. Uh, so there's specific statutes sometimes written to address specific problems like that. Uh, but then there's also kind of what we call like catch-all type statutes, that incorporate or include a wide range of behaviors. So like child molestation, right? It's basically everything short of sexual, stuff. And so you need to familiarize yourself to some extent with it. But for the purposes of this class, for the first assignment anyway, I'm going to have you guys just pick a statute, any statute, and look through it and identify, what are the mens rea and actus rea elements of that crime. So that being said, if you need anything, email me, and have a good week. See you next week.